Azaku was 9 years old when she dug up her first skeleton, and it told her who had murdered it. She had been playing at the edge of the burial grounds, where the children of Mbawezi were forbidden to go, when her foot broke through the soft earth and plunged into something hollow beneath. She fell forward, her hands sinking into soil that crumbled away to reveal bones, yellow, white, and ancient, arranged in the shape of a man who had died curled on his side. The other children screamed and ran. Azaku did not run. She knelt beside the exposed skeleton, brushing dirt from the skull, and that was when she heard it. A voice that was not a voice. A whisper that crawled up through her fingertips and into her mind, filling her head with images and sounds and feelings that did not belong to her. She saw a man running through a forest at night, blood streaming from a wound in his back. She felt his terror, his confusion, his desperate need to escape. She heard the footsteps behind him, gaining, always gaining. She saw him fall, saw a face looming over him, saw the stone axe rising and falling, until there was nothing left but darkness. The man's name had been Obuwe. He had been a farmer. He had been killed by his brother over a dispute about land. That was 200 years ago. The brother was long dead. The land they had fought over had changed hands a dozen times. But the bones remembered, and now Azaku remembered too. Her mother found her an hour later, still kneeling in the dirt, still holding Obuwe's skull, whispering his name over and over while tears carved tracks through the grave soil on her face. That was the day Azaku's childhood ended. And that was the day something else began. The elders of Mbawezi wanted her dead. Not all of them, but enough. The gift she possessed was unnatural, they said. It came from dark spirits, from forces that good people did not meddle with. A child who could speak to the dead was a child who belonged with the dead. They came for her on the 7th night after her discovery. 12 men with torches and machetes, led by the chief elder, a man named Gathu whose own grandfather was buried in the cemetery where Azaku had fallen. They surrounded her mother's hut in the hour before dawn, when the village was sleeping and no one would witness what they planned to do. But they had forgotten something important. The bones knew they were coming. Every skeleton in the burial ground had been whispering warnings to Azaku for days. The dead of Mbawezi did not want their speaker to be silenced. They had been waiting for someone like her for centuries, someone who could hear their stories, someone who could carry their truths into the world of the living. When Gathu and his men burst through the door of the hut, they found it empty. Azaku and her mother, Inkases, had fled 3 hours earlier, guided by voices that only Azaku could hear, following paths that the dead remembered from their own lives. The men searched until dawn. They searched for 3 more days. They never found the girl or her mother. But Azaku found something else. The cave was hidden behind a waterfall, in a valley that the living had forgotten but the dead still remembered. Obuwe had shown it to her, or rather, the memory of Obuwe, preserved in his bones, had revealed the path he had taken 200 years ago when he was fleeing from the brother who would eventually kill him. He had found the cave but had not reached it in time. Azaku reached it with hours to spare. Inside, she found bones. Thousands of them. The cave had been a burial site once, long before Mbawezi existed, long before the current kingdom had been founded. Generations of people had brought their dead here, laying them to rest in chambers that wound deep into the mountain, stacking skulls and femurs and ribcages in patterns that spoke of rituals lost to time. The moment Azaku entered the cave, the voices hit her like a wave. She collapsed, overwhelmed by the sheer number of dead crying out to be heard. Centuries of lives poured into her mind, a flood of memories and deaths and secrets that threatened to drown her consciousness entirely. She screamed, clutching her head, feeling herself dissolving into the endless chorus of the dead. Her mother caught her before she hit the ground. Inkases held her daughter, shouting her name, begging her to come back, to stay with her, to not be lost to the voices. And in the chaos of that moment, one voice rose above the others. It was calm. It was ancient. It was the voice of a woman who had died so long ago that even the oldest bones in the cave could not remember her living. She called herself Zawati, and she had been waiting for Azaku for a very long time. Zawati had been the first bone reader. 3,000 years ago, she had discovered the same gift that Azaku now possessed. She had learned to speak with the dead, to carry their stories, to use their knowledge in the world of the living. She had served kings and advised councils. She had solved murders and exposed conspiracies. She had been worshipped as a goddess and hunted as a demon. And when she died, she had not fully departed. Her consciousness had remained anchored to her bones, waiting in this cave where her followers had laid her to rest, preserving her knowledge for the day when another bone reader would be born. She had waited through centuries of silence, through the rise and fall of kingdoms, through ages when no one with the gift walked the earth. Now finally Azaku had come. Zawati taught her how to control the voices, how to filter the chorus of the dead, selecting which bones to listen to and which to silence, how to protect her mind from being overwhelmed by the sheer weight of accumulated memory, how to use her gift without being destroyed by it. The training took 3 years. Azaku lived in the cave with her mother, venturing out only when necessary, spending her days in communion with the ancient dead. She learned the history of her gift, the lineage of bone readers who had come before her, the secrets they had uncovered and the prices they had paid. She learned that her gift was not just about speaking with the dead. It was about truth. The bones could not lie. They remembered exactly what had happened, without distortion or self-deception. A bone reader who mastered their gift could become the ultimate arbiter of truth, capable of exposing any lie, solving any mystery, revealing any secret. This power was dangerous. Zawati warned her of this again and again. Kings had killed to possess bone readers. Others had killed to destroy them. The truth was a weapon, and those who wielded it became targets. When Azaku finally emerged from the cave at 17 years old, she was no longer the frightened girl who had fled Mbawezi. She was something else entirely. She was ready. The Kingdom of Essaba was tearing itself apart. 3 brothers had inherited their father's throne 30 years ago, and none had been willing to share. They had divided the kingdom into thirds, each ruling their portion, each plotting to destroy the others. The war had killed tens of thousands and showed no signs of ending. Azaku did not care about the politics. She cared about the dead. The battlefields of Essaba were filled with bones that cried out for justice. Soldiers who had been betrayed by their commanders. Civilians who had been massacred for supporting the wrong side. Children who had starved when armies burned the crops. Their voices reached Azaku even in her hidden cave, a growing chorus of suffering that she could no longer ignore. She left her mother in the safety of the mountain and traveled to Essaba alone. What she found was worse than the voices had prepared her for. The kingdom was a wasteland. Burned villages dotted the landscape like scars. Refugees clogged the roads, fleeing from battles that seemed to happen everywhere at once. The 3 brothers, Mwavu and Enyima and Zikora, had become old men still fighting a war that had consumed their entire adult lives. Azaku walked through this devastation, and the bones spoke to her at every step. They told her about the atrocities committed by all 3 sides. They told her about the lies that had started the war and the lies that kept it going. They told her secrets that would destroy all 3 kings if they were ever revealed. She began to form a plan, but before she could execute it, someone found her. His name was Tendaji, and he was a spy. He worked for King Enyima, the middle brother, gathering intelligence on enemy movements and rival plots. He had been tracking rumors of a young woman who could speak to the dead, a bone reader whose gift could turn the tide of the war if she could be captured and controlled. He found Azaku kneeling in a field of bones, her hands pressed to a skull, her eyes closed, her lips moving silently as she listened to stories that only she could hear. He was supposed to capture her. Those were his orders. Bring the bone reader to Enyima by force if necessary, so that she could be used as a weapon against the other brothers. But Tendaji did not capture her. He watched her for 3 days instead, fascinated by what he saw. She moved through the dead with such tenderness, such respect, treating every skeleton as if it were a person rather than a pile of bones. She wept for strangers who had died before she was born. She whispered apologies to victims she had never wronged. She was not a weapon. She was something else. Something that Tendaji had never encountered in all his years of war and espionage. On the fourth day, he approached her openly. He told her who he was. He told her who had sent him. He told her what he was supposed to do and why he was not going to do it. Azaku listened in silence. When he finished, she asked him one question. She asked if he wanted to know how his mother had really died. Tendaji's mother had died when he was 7 years old. He had been told it was an illness, a fever that had taken her in the night. His father had remarried within a year, a woman who had never treated Tendaji as her own, who had made his childhood a misery of neglect and casual cruelty. He had always accepted the story of his mother's death. He had never had reason to doubt it. But Azaku could see the truth in his eyes, a child's doubt that had never fully faded, a suspicion buried so deep that he himself did not know it was there. She took his hand and led him to a cemetery 3 miles from where they stood. She found a grave with no marker, a patch of earth that looked no different from the ground around it. She knelt and pressed her hands to the soil, and then she told him his mother had not died of fever. She had been poisoned by Tendaji's father, who had fallen in love with another woman and wanted to be free of his first wife. The poison had been slow, mimicking illness, leaving no evidence that the healers could find. His mother had died not knowing that her husband had killed her. Her final thoughts a prayer for the son she was leaving behind. Tendaji listened without moving. His face showed nothing. But when Azaku finished speaking, she saw something break behind his eyes. He fell to his knees beside his mother's unmarked grave and wept for the first time in 20 years. When he finally rose, he was a different man. He asked Azaku what she was planning to do. She told him about the 3 kings, about the secrets she had learned, about her intention to force them into peace by threatening to expose their crimes. Tendaji offered to help. He knew the courts, the politics, the hidden pathways that connected the 3 kingdoms. He knew how to get close to powerful men without being detected. He knew things that would make Azaku's plan possible. She accepted his offer. She did not yet know that accepting it would nearly cost her everything. The plan was simple. Azaku would gather evidence against all 3 kings, secrets so damaging that exposure would destroy them. She would arrange a meeting at a neutral location. She would present her evidence and offer them a choice: peace or ruin. The execution was more complicated. For 2 years, Azaku traveled the kingdom with Tendaji at her side. They visited battlefields and burial sites, mass graves and hidden tombs. They collected bones and listened to their stories, building a case against each of the 3 brothers that would shatter their power if it ever became public. King Mwavu had poisoned his own father to hasten his inheritance, then blamed his brothers for the death. This lie was the original cause of the war. King Enyima had murdered his own son, a young man named Dabaku who had been secretly negotiating peace with his uncles. Enyima had discovered the negotiations and killed the boy to prevent reconciliation. King Zikora had sold information to foreign powers, trading secrets about his own kingdom in exchange for weapons. He had betrayed his people to outsiders, prolonging the war for personal advantage. Any one of these revelations would be devastating. Together, they would be catastrophic. But gathering the evidence was only half the challenge. The other half was staying alive long enough to use it. King Enyima discovered that his spy had turned traitor. The how did not matter. Perhaps another spy had seen Tendaji with Azaku. Perhaps an informant had reported their movements. Perhaps Enyima had simply grown suspicious when his agent failed to return with the bone reader. What mattered was that Enyima sent assassins. They came in the night, 12 of them, trained killers who specialized in eliminating threats to the throne. They surrounded the abandoned farmhouse where Azaku and Tendaji were sleeping, waiting for the signal that would launch their attack. They did not know that the farmhouse sat on the site of a massacre. 40 years ago, during the early days of the war, soldiers loyal to King Mwavu had slaughtered an entire family in this building. The bones still lay beneath the floor, hidden by decades of dust and neglect. They had been calling to Azaku since she arrived, telling her their stories, warning her of what had happened here, and warning her of what was about to happen again. Azaku woke Tendaji an hour before the assassins made their move. They escaped through a root cellar that the killers did not know existed, following a path that the massacre victims remembered from their childhood. The assassins found an empty building. They reported their failure to King Enyema. Enyema responded by putting a price on the Bone Reader's head so large that every mercenary, thief, and desperate soldier in the kingdom began searching for her. The hunt had begun. For 6 months, Azaku and Tendaji ran. They moved constantly, never staying in one place for more than a few days, relying on the dead to warn them of approaching danger. The bones became their spies, their scouts, their early warning system. Every grave they passed was a potential ally, every skeleton a source of information about the living who moved through the world above. But running was not enough. The hunters were everywhere, and they were getting closer. Azaku knew she had to accelerate her plan. She sent messages to all 3 kings, not through normal channels but through the bones themselves. She visited the graves of each king's ancestors and spoke to their remains, implanting messages that would echo through the royal bloodlines, whispers that would reach the kings in their dreams. She told them she had information that would end the war. She told them to meet her at the Temple of Amadioha, where the 3 territories intersected. She told them to come alone without guards or armies. She told them that if they did not come, she would reveal everything she knew. The kings had no reason to trust her. They had every reason to believe it was a trap. But the messages she sent came through channels that no living person could have accessed. The voices of their own ancestors, speaking from beyond the grave, carrying words that only a bone reader could have implanted. They could not ignore such a summons. One by one, the 3 brothers agreed to meet. The Temple of Amadioha stood at the top of a sacred hill, built 1,000 years before the current conflict, maintained by priests who owed allegiance to no kingdom. Azaku arrived 3 days early. She brought bones with her, hundreds of them, collected from across the kingdom over 2 years of travel. She arranged them in the temple's central chamber, creating a circle of the dead around the place where the kings would stand. Each bone was a witness, a voice ready to speak, a truth waiting to be revealed. Tendaji positioned himself in the hills above the temple, watching for treachery. The kings had promised to come alone, but promises meant nothing in a war that had lasted 30 years. On the appointed day, the brothers arrived. Mwavu came first, old and suspicious, his eyes scanning the temple for hidden threats. Enyema came second, missing the arm he had lost to an assassination attempt, his remaining hand never far from the knife at his belt. Zecora came last, the youngest, the most dangerous, his face a mask that revealed nothing. The 3 brothers had not been in the same room for 30 years. They had spent those decades trying to destroy each other. Now they stood together, surrounded by bones, facing a young woman who held their fates in her hands. Azaku spoke. She told them what she knew. She pointed to specific bones as evidence, naming the dead, describing their deaths, connecting each skeleton to secrets that the kings had believed were buried forever. She told Mwavu that she had touched his father's skull, that she had heard the old king's final moments, the confusion as the poison took hold, the realization that his own son had killed him. She watched Mwavu's face go pale. She told Enyema that she had held the bones of his son Dabiku, that she knew about the secret peace negotiations, about the murder disguised as a battlefield casualty, about the father who had killed his own child to keep the war going. She watched Enyema's hand begin to tremble. She told Zecora about the foreign soldiers whose remains she had examined, men who had died in battles they should not have been fighting, carrying weapons they should not have possessed. She told him about the bargains he had made, the betrayals he had committed, the enemy kingdoms that knew his secrets and could expose him at any moment. She watched Zecora's mask finally crack. Then she made her offer. Peace or ruin. Those were the only options. The 3 kings could end the war, unite their kingdoms, create a new form of government that prevented any single ruler from accumulating too much power. If they did this, Azaku would keep their secrets. The bones would remain silent. Their crimes would go with them to their graves. Or they could refuse. They could try to have her killed, try to silence the truth, try to continue the war that had already consumed 30 years and countless lives. But if they chose this path, Azaku would ensure that their secrets were revealed, not just to their own people but to every kingdom on the continent. She had spent 2 years preparing for this moment. She had allies in every court, agents ready to spread the truth, bones positioned in locations that the kings could not reach. She could not be stopped. The dead could not be silenced. The brothers had one chance to end this cleanly. This was it. Silence filled the temple. The 3 kings looked at each other, these old men who had wasted their lives on a war that none of them could win. They saw their own reflections in each other's eyes. Tired, bitter, broken by decades of conflict. Mwavu spoke first. He said he was tired. He said he had been tired for years, but pride had not let him admit it. He said he had poisoned his father and had regretted it every day since, had fought this war partly because he could not face what he had done, had killed thousands to avoid confronting the guilt of killing one. He agreed to peace. Enyema spoke next. He said he still saw his son's face in his dreams. He said Dabiku had been right, that peace was the only path forward, that he had killed the best part of himself when he killed his boy. He said he would do anything to undo that murder, but since he could not, he would do the next best thing. He agreed to peace. Zecora spoke last. He said nothing about guilt or regret. He said only that he was a practical man, that he recognized when he was beaten, that he would rather share power than lose everything. He agreed to peace. And in that moment, 30 years of war came to an end. But the story was not over. As the 3 kings began to discuss the terms of their reconciliation, something unexpected happened. The bones in the temple began to glow. Azaku felt a surge of power unlike anything she had experienced before. The voices of the dead, which had always been whispers, suddenly became a roar. Hundreds of souls crying out at once, their combined energy flooding through her body, threatening to tear her apart. She collapsed, convulsing on the temple floor. The 3 kings stepped back in alarm. Tendaji burst through the doors, sword drawn, only to freeze when he saw what was happening. The bones were rising. They floated into the air, spinning around Azaku in a vortex of ancient remains. The skulls aligned themselves, the femurs interlocked, the ribcages merged. Something was being built from the accumulated dead, a figure taking shape in the swirling chaos. Zawati was emerging. The ancient bone reader had been waiting for this moment for 3,000 years. She had not simply been preserving knowledge for a future student. She had been waiting for an opportunity, a moment when enough power was concentrated in one place, enough death and enough truth and enough living souls for her to finally break free from the prison of her bones. She was using Azaku as a doorway. Tendaji moved first. He did not understand what was happening, but he understood that Azaku was in danger. He threw himself into the vortex of bones, reaching for her, trying to pull her free from whatever force was consuming her. The bones struck him like fists, cutting his skin, cracking his ribs, but he kept pushing forward. He had lost his mother to a murder he had never known about. He had served a tyrant because he thought he had no other choice. He had finally found something worth fighting for, and he was not going to lose it now. He reached Azaku and wrapped his arms around her. He felt the power flowing through her, the ancient consciousness trying to use her as a vessel. He felt Zawati's will pressing against his own, trying to force him away. He held on anyway, and in his mind he heard a voice. Not Zawati, not the chorus of the dead. It was Azaku's voice, small and frightened, calling out from somewhere deep inside herself where she had been pushed by Zawati's invasion. She said she could not fight alone. She said Zawati was too strong. She said she needed something to hold on to, something to remind her of who she was. Tendaji gave her what she needed. He told her about the first time he had seen her, kneeling in that field of bones, weeping for strangers. He told her about watching her for 3 days, falling in love with her compassion before he even knew her name. He told her about his mother, about the truth Azaku had given him, about the peace he had finally found after 20 years of not knowing. He told her that she was not just a vessel for the dead. She was a living woman with a living heart, and he was not going to let her be consumed by a ghost who had waited too long for power she had no right to claim. He told her he loved her, and in the depths of Azaku's consciousness, those words became an anchor. Azaku fought back. She had been trained by Zawati, had learned everything the ancient bone reader knew, had absorbed 3,000 years of accumulated wisdom. But that training had been designed to prepare her for exactly this moment, to make her a suitable vessel for Zawati's resurrection. What Zawati had not anticipated was that Azaku would have something worth fighting for. The love of a man who had chosen her over everything else. The memory of her mother, who had protected her since childhood. The voices of the countless dead she had helped over the years, souls who had found peace because she had listened to their stories. These were not just memories, they were connections, threads that tied her to the world of the living, that reminded her who she was, that gave her the strength to resist being consumed. Azaku gathered those threads and wove them into a weapon. She turned on Zawati, using the techniques the Ancient One had taught her, using the knowledge she had gained from 2 years of listening to the dead. She did not try to destroy Zawati. That was impossible. The ancient consciousness was too powerful, too deeply embedded in the bones that surrounded them. Instead, she did something else. She listened. She reached past Zawati's hunger for resurrection and found what lay beneath. 3,000 years of loneliness. 3,000 years of waiting. 3,000 years of watching other bone readers come and go, each one too weak or too unprepared to receive what Zawati had to offer. Zawati was not evil. She was desperate. She had been the first bone reader, the one who had discovered the gift and developed its techniques. She had devoted her life to truth and justice, had used her power to help countless people, had died believing that her work would continue through future generations. But the gift had become rare. The knowledge had been lost. The bone readers who came after her were untrained, unprepared, destroyed by their own power before they could carry on her legacy. Zawati had watched for 3,000 years as everything she had built crumbled to nothing. She was not trying to steal Azaku's body out of malice. She was trying to save her life's work. Azaku made a different offer. She could not let Zawati take her body. That would mean her own death, the end of everything she was. But she could offer something else. Partnership, not possession, not consumption, a sharing of consciousness, 2 bone readers existing together in a single body, combining their knowledge and their power to accomplish more than either could alone. Zawati would finally have a connection to the living world. She would be able to continue her work through Azaku, to guide and teach and influence. She would no longer be alone, and Azaku would have access to 3,000 years of accumulated wisdom. She would be the most powerful bone reader who had ever lived, capable of feats that no single person could achieve. It was a risk. Sharing her consciousness with an ancient spirit could change her in ways she could not predict. But the alternative was destruction, for her and for Zawati both. The ancient bone reader considered the offer. She thought about 3,000 years of solitude. She thought about the generations of bone readers she had watched destroy themselves. She thought about the work that still needed to be done, the truths that still needed to be revealed, the dead who still needed someone to hear their stories. She accepted. The vortex of bones collapsed. The skulls and femurs and ribcages fell to the temple floor, clattering into piles around Azaku and Tendaji. The light faded. The roar of voices diminished to the familiar whisper that Azaku had known since childhood. She opened her eyes and found Tendaji holding her, his face covered in cuts, his eyes filled with fear. She told him she was all right. She told him that Zawati was still there, a presence at the back of her mind, but no longer a threat. They had reached an understanding. They had found a way to coexist. The 3 kings, who had watched all of this in stunned silence, now approached cautiously. They asked what had happened. They asked if the agreement still stood. Azaku rose to her feet, Tendaji supporting her weight. She told them the agreement stood. The war would end. The kingdom would be reunified. Their secrets would remain buried. But she added a condition that had not been part of the original offer. She would serve as an advisor to the new government. Not a ruler, not a judge, just a voice that could be consulted when truth was needed. Zawati's knowledge would be preserved and passed on. The techniques of the bone readers would be recorded, so that future generations with the gift would not have to struggle alone. The kings agreed. They had no choice. The war ended within the year. The negotiations were difficult, the compromises painful, but the three brothers had seen too much to continue fighting. They had stood in a temple surrounded by the bones of their victims and watched an ancient power nearly consume the woman who held their secrets. They had been reminded that there were forces in the world greater than their ambitions. The kingdom was reunified under a council system that prevented any single ruler from dominating. The brothers retained their titles but surrendered their armies. A new era began, one built on the ashes of 30 years of destruction. Azaku and Tendaji married in the spring. It was a quiet ceremony, held in the mountain cave where Azaku had spent 3 years training with Zawati. Her mother Inkases attended, old now but still strong, still watching over her daughter with the fierce protectiveness that had never faded. Zawati was there too, present in Azaku's mind, offering silent congratulations to the young woman who had shown her a different way forward. They had children, 3 of them, 2 daughters and a son. None inherited Azaku's gift, for which she was grateful. She loved her power, but she also understood its weight, and she did not wish that weight upon her children. But she made sure they understood the responsibility that came with truth. Azaku served the United Kingdom for 40 years. She solved crimes and exposed conspiracies. She helped families find closure for old losses. She trained the occasional young person who was born with the gift, teaching them the techniques that Zawati had developed over 3,000 years, ensuring that no bone reader would ever have to face their power alone. The dead still spoke to her everywhere she went. They told her stories of lives cut short and truths that had been buried. She listened to all of them. She honored all of them. She carried their voices inside her like a sacred trust. Zawati's presence faded over the decades, the ancient consciousness gradually merging with Azaku's own until they were no longer truly separate. The knowledge remained, but the distinct voice that had once challenged her for control became a part of who she was. When Azaku finally died at 87 years old, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, and the husband who had never stopped loving her, she went peacefully. Tendaji held her hand as she passed, just as she had held the hands of so many dying strangers over the years. He told her he would see her again soon. He told her he loved her. She smiled and closed her eyes, and the bones throughout the kingdom, for one brief moment, fell completely silent. They buried her in the cave where she had first met Zawati, in the mountain where she had spent 3 years learning to control her gift. The funeral was attended by thousands, people who had traveled from every corner of the kingdom to honor the woman who had ended the Great War and dedicated her life to truth. Her children spoke of her kindness. Her grandchildren spoke of her stories. Tendaji, old now but still standing straight, spoke of a love that had lasted 50 years and would last forever. But the strangest thing happened as the last stones were placed over her grave. The bones in the cave began to glow, not with the violent energy that had marked Zawati's attempted resurrection, but with a soft, warm light. The glow spread from skeleton to skeleton, moving through the ancient burial site, touching every set of remains that Azaku had listened to over the years. And then the light faded, and the bones went still. Those who were there swore that they felt something pass through them in that moment. A wave of peace, of completion, of stories finally told and truths finally known. The dead who had been waiting for centuries to be heard had finally found their voice, and they had found their rest. That is the story of Azaku, the bone reader. That is how a girl who fell into a grave became the most powerful truth seeker the world had ever known. That is how she ended a war, defeated an ancient spirit, and found love in the midst of chaos. That is how she lived a full life, raised a family, and died surrounded by those who loved her. And that is how the dead learned to speak through the living. So remember, when you walk through a cemetery or pass a burial site, when you see bones that have been forgotten by time, that someone once listened to their stories, someone once cared about their truths, someone once made sure that even the dead would not be forgotten. Be kind to the bones you encounter. They may have more to say than you know. And somewhere in the great beyond, Azaku is still listening.